The first crack didn't look like betrayal. It looked like silence. It was the kind that crept in slowly, settling between us on the couch at night, filling the space where conversations used to live. My husband would scroll on his phone while I pretended to read. Both of us acting like this was normal, like love didn't need words anymore. I told myself marriages changed. Everyone said that. Still, something felt off. He stopped asking about my day. Not all at once, but in pieces. First, he forgot small details. Then he stopped following up. Eventually, he stopped asking at all. When I spoke, his eyes would drift, his nods arriving half a second too late. I learned to trail off before finishing sentences, embarrassed by my own need to be heard. There were other things too, subtle things. He began guarding his phone like it held state secrets. If I walked into the room, the screen would dim. If I sat too close, he'd angle it away. Once, when I reached for it to check the time, he flinched. Actually flinched. I laughed it off. He laughed too, but his sounded thinner. Money became his new obsession. He asked questions he'd never cared about before: how much was in our joint account, where my bonus went, why I hadn't moved my inheritance into the savings for simplicity. He said it casually, like he was organizing a drawer, not our lives. I reminded myself that being responsible wasn't a crime. But love doesn't suddenly turn into accounting. At night, lying beside him, I noticed how he turned away from me in his sleep. His back felt like a wall I hadn't agreed to build. I stared at the ceiling, counting the fan rotations, wondering when I had become someone who missed her husband while he was still in the room. One evening, I suggested a weekend away, just us. He hesitated just a beat too long before saying he was busy. Busy with what? I didn't know. He didn't offer details, and I didn't ask. I was afraid of the answer. The truth began to form not as a thought, but as a feeling, a heavy, sinking certainty. He was preparing for a life that didn't include me. The moment that confirmed it wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no confrontation, just an accident. I was cleaning the kitchen late, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. His laptop sat open on the table. I wasn't snooping, I swear that to myself even now. I only meant to close it. That's when I saw the email, a subject line: clean, professional, devastating, initial consultation, divorce proceedings. My hands went numb. The room tilted, like my body had briefly forgotten how gravity worked. I didn't read the rest. I didn't need to. That one line rewrote the last 10 years of my life. I closed the laptop gently, almost tenderly, as if touching it too hard would make the truth scream. That night, I cried into my pillow so quietly I surprised myself. I mourned the man I thought I married. I mourned the future I assumed was guaranteed. Mostly, I mourned my own blindness, but beneath the grief, something else stirred. Awareness. If he was planning an ending, he had started it long before telling me. And if I kept pretending not to see the cracks, I wouldn't just lose my marriage. I would lose myself with it. By morning, my tears were gone. In their place was a calm I didn't recognize yet. Denial had finally let go. And for the first time, I stopped waiting for him to choose me and began paying attention to what I needed to do next. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the half-closed blinds, painting faint stripes across the polished wooden floor. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through me, a quiet contrast to the storm brewing inside. 2 weeks had passed since I had quietly moved my assets. It was supposed to feel like a small, practical act, but in reality, every decision I made now carried weight, a tension I couldn't shake. Every financial transfer felt like a declaration of self-preservation, every careful withdrawal a shield against the man I once called my partner. I hadn't slept much these past nights, not from worry, but from a strange cocktail of fear and anticipation. Fear, because the life we had built together could collapse in a moment, and anticipation because I had learned something crucial about myself. I wasn't as powerless as I had once believed. That knowledge alone gave me an odd sort of satisfaction, even as guilt gnawed at the edges of my conscience. When James finally arrived home that evening, I was seated at the kitchen table, the laptop open, quietly reviewing statements. He didn't notice my subtle observation at first. He never did. I watched him slump into the chair across from me, his tie loosened, his eyes tired but sharp, like a predator pretending to be weary. "Long day?" I asked, careful to keep my tone light. He grunted, not meeting my gaze. "You could say that?" I let the silence linger, tasting the tension that hung between us like an invisible thread stretched too thin. There was something different about him lately, something I hadn't been able to name until now. A distant glimmer in his eyes, a calculated pause before speaking, the way his hand lingered on his drink longer than necessary. The signs were subtle, almost laughable if it weren't so painfully familiar. I had seen this look before in other marriages, in other stories, always followed by betrayal. I swallowed, holding back the sharp words that formed in my throat. "You've been quiet lately," I ventured. "Is something bothering you?" He finally looked at me, and there it was. The flicker of something I hadn't wanted to see. Regret, or perhaps just surprise that I wasn't oblivious. "Nothing," he said finally, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. "Work is just work." I nodded, pretending to accept it, but inside my mind was racing. I had learned to read him like an open ledger, to anticipate the moves he thought I couldn't see coming. And tonight, the ledger was about to reveal its most uncomfortable entry. As the evening wore on, I continued my quiet observation, taking note of every slip, every careless gesture. I had learned from past mistakes that revenge was never about shouting or confrontation. It was about patience, precision, and timing. The assets I had moved were only the first step. They were the first domino in a chain that I intended to control completely. By the time he excused himself to the study, muttering about finishing some reports, I allowed myself a small, victorious smile. The cracks beneath the surface were no longer hidden, they were spreading, subtle but undeniable. And for the first time in months, I felt the sharp thrill of clarity, the knowledge that I had prepared for this moment better than he had. As I closed the laptop, I whispered to the empty room, a promise I couldn't yet say aloud. 2 weeks from now, everything changes. And this time, I'll be the one holding the pen. The house was quiet again, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a clock ticking. Each tick echoed like a drumbeat of inevitability, counting down to the moment when all the careful planning, all the silent fortitude would pay off. I wasn't just waiting anymore. I was ready. And deep down, I knew that when the storm finally hit, he would be the one left staring at the ruins, wondering how he had underestimated me. The days that followed felt almost surreal, like walking on a fragile bridge suspended over a chasm I could barely see. James went about his routine as though nothing had changed, but the cracks I had noticed were widening with every passing hour. I watched him from across the breakfast table, noticing the small things, the flicker of hesitation when he reached for a file, the way his phone screen lit up and he quickly hid it from view. Subtle tension in his shoulders. He was careful, yes, but I had grown too skilled at reading him. I could feel the panic beneath his composed exterior, even before he realized it himself. I found a strange comfort in my careful observation. Each small sign of his unease was like a spark in the dark, illuminating the path I had painstakingly set. Moving my assets had been just the beginning. Now I was quietly orchestrating the next act, knowing that timing was everything. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted inevitability. I wanted him to walk into the consequences of his actions without realizing that I had quietly built the walls around him. That evening after dinner, I watched as he retreated to his study, the faint click of the door signaling another day of pretended normalcy. Alone, I allowed myself a small victory smile, closing my journal where I had been tracking his behaviors and small inconsistencies. Each entry was a piece of evidence, a puzzle I was assembling in secret. I remembered the days I had spent questioning myself, wondering if I was overreacting, doubting my instincts. But the subtle betrayals, the half-truths, the late night calls he never mentioned, they were all too real. I decided it was time to test the waters. I sent a casual message to a trusted lawyer friend, carefully phrasing it to sound like idle curiosity about marital asset protection. I watched as James, unaware, walked past the room, picking up his briefcase as if nothing had changed. But something in his expression, a flash of unease, betrayed him. I didn't need words. His body language was confirmation enough. He was thinking, plotting, and most importantly, he was underestimating me. Later that night, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, letting the cool air wash over me. The city lights twinkled below like 1,000 tiny secrets, and I realized that I was no longer afraid. The fear that had once made me freeze, that had made me doubt my own intuition, was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady determination. I had learned that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, and it waited, and it struck with precision. As I turned back inside, I caught a glimpse of James in the reflection of the glass. He was scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the silent storm brewing just behind him. The thought brought a strange satisfaction, a sense of justice that felt sweet, not cruel. I had no desire to humiliate him unnecessarily, no need for petty confrontations. I only wanted the truth to reveal itself, for the consequences of his choices to unfold naturally. In that quiet moment, I understood the delicate balance I was maintaining: patience, observation, and a carefully concealed power. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was reclaiming the control I had lost when I first trusted him blindly. And I knew that when the moment finally came, the world we had built together would fracture in a way that was irreversible. For now I waited. Each day brought a new subtle sign, a hint of the inevitable, and each night I planned quietly, letting the calm before the storm stretch as long as possible. When the storm came, I would be ready, not angry, not vengeful in the reckless sense, but clear, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. And deep down, I knew that he would finally understand the quiet power of the woman he had tried to underestimate. The day James filed for divorce arrived like a sudden, sharp wind. I had been anticipating it, yet the reality of seeing the official papers in my hands still sent a shiver down my spine, not from fear, but from the electric pulse of inevitability. 2 weeks, that was all it had taken for his carefully constructed plan to finally reveal itself. And yet, the irony was delicious. Everything he thought would give him control had already slipped through his fingers. I sat at the dining table, the crisp white envelope lying in front of me, my fingers brushing over it lightly as if testing its weight. It seemed heavier than it should have been, not in paper or ink, but in consequence. Each line, each clause, each legal phrase was a testament to the life we had shared, the life he had believed he could unravel at will. But he hadn't accounted for me, not truly. I called my lawyer first, keeping my voice steady, calm, measured. There was no trembling, no hysteria, only precision. "I've received the petition," I said. "Let's review it carefully." My lawyer's pause on the other end of the line was almost imperceptible, but I knew it was there. Even she felt the shift in power, subtle though it was. After the call, I placed the papers back on the table and leaned back, letting the silence of the house envelop me. I could hear James moving upstairs, probably pacing, probably rehearsing the words he would use when he confronted me. He would not find the scene he expected. There would be no frantic pleas, no tearful breakdowns. I had already prepared, already fortified myself, and now I could watch as his carefully timed plan began to unravel without me ever raising my voice. I thought back to the quiet hours I had spent transferring assets, each step deliberate, each move calculated to protect myself without alerting him. At the time, it had felt cold, almost merciless, but now it felt like survival, a quiet shield I had built with patience and clarity. The truth was that revenge didn't need to be loud. It simply needed to be inevitable, and I had mastered inevitability. Later that evening, James approached me, the papers clutched in his hand, his eyes flickering with a mix of expectation and frustration. He expected panic. He expected shock. Instead, I looked up at him calmly, almost serenely, and said nothing for a moment, letting the weight of silence do the work for me. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady and deliberate. I received these. I said, gesturing to the envelope. And I've already taken steps to protect what's mine. I didn't need to explain further. The calm certainty in my tone was enough to unsettle him. He blinked, unprepared for the composure he had assumed would crumble at his first strike. The rest of the evening passed in a delicate dance of pretense. He tried to maintain authority, but I could see the cracks spreading beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Every word, every glance betrayed a growing realization. The game was no longer his to control, and the realization alone was intoxicating. A quiet, sharp thrill that I let linger. As I closed the door to my bedroom that night, I felt the first real stirrings of something I had not felt in years: empowerment. This was not about hatred. This was about reclaiming myself, about standing firm while the man who had underestimated me realized that the ground beneath him was no longer solid. I had waited, I had prepared, and now the first domino had fallen. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning.